Australia's dirty economy. The hidden environmental cost ### the energy crisis in China. A market failure in the past 3 weeks, the world's second largest economy, China, has been plagued by continuous blackouts. More than half of its provinces have been subjected to strict energy rationing. Businesses have been forced to close early, factories have been told to reduce production, and even essential services like traffic lights and elevators have been shutting down with little or no warning, causing chaos in a country with heavy traffic and numerous skyscrapers. The real tragedy here is that all of this is simply a market failure. There have been no natural disasters or conflicts that have destroyed power lines or shut down power plants. In fact, the country's capacity to produce and supply energy is the best it has ever been. So, there is something more going on here. Regardless of the underlying causes, this couldn't have come at a worse time. China was in the process of rebuilding its economy after the pandemic, preparing to host the Winter Olympics, and dealing with the collapse of some of its largest companies. Even in the best of times, power outages like these can be devastating. Economic prosperity and, by extension, living standards are closely correlated with access to energy. Some economists and scientists have theorized that energy could effectively be the de facto currency of the future, or at least an excellent store of value. In many ways, it almost is today. But there are some things we need to understand before diving into the heart of the matter. ### Understanding the root cause. So, what is the fundamental reason behind the Chinese blackouts? What could this teach us about the relationship between our modern global economy and energy? And finally, what could we learn from this problem when we inevitably face our own energy challenges in the coming decades? China's energy crisis actually began 2 years ago when the government initiated reforms to liberalize the nation's energy sector. Until then, the relationship between power plant operators and grid operators was almost entirely dictated by the government. Companies that operated power plants produced a certain amount of energy and sold it to grid operators at a set price. These grid operators then supplied that energy to businesses and households at a slightly higher price, resulting in a profit. This might be a bit controversial, but the production and distribution of energy is actually one of those markets that does well with some government controls in place for a few reasons. First, it is a market prone to monopolization. The extremely high barriers to entry for building a power plant or setting up a power grid mean that only the largest companies in a given country could even consider making the necessary investment to compete with an existing supplier. It is also heavily dependent on land as a factor of production. Like all products, the production and supply of energy require a certain combination of land, labor, and capital. We've already seen that the capital requirements, such as power plants and power lines, are extremely significant. But land is perhaps an even greater barrier to entry into this market. Power lines occupy a considerable amount of space distributed throughout suburbs and industrial centers, and people naturally don't like them running through their backyards. If bringing a competing energy source to the market meant building a competing power grid, then unsightly power lines, substations, and high-voltage towers would be multiplied by 2, or, if there are many competitors in the market, by however many companies decided to build their own infrastructure to compete for end-user dollars. Despite this being very expensive in terms of materials, it is also comically unrealistic because only a dozen or so suppliers could occupy all the usable land around urban areas. This is why services like roads, waterworks, and power are subject to strict government regulations. In many cases, they are totally government-run, but even when privatized, they are normally sold to large companies with equally extensive regulations on what they are allowed to do. This is exactly what happened in China. There are hundreds of power plants across the country, primarily coal-fired. These power plants sell their energy to grid operators who are legally required to sell their energy at a predetermined price. This price regulation means that grid operators, who have an effective monopoly on energy distribution, cannot charge whatever they want for energy to generate enormous profits. Instead, they must charge this government-imposed price. This eliminates the problem of monopoly pricing power but causes another problem. The power grid can reasonably only purchase energy from suppliers at a price lower than what they are authorized to sell it for. So, if the price of coal more than quadruples within 12 months, it will cost more to produce coal-based electricity than what these grid operators are authorized to sell it for. Therefore, they simply do not purchase the electricity, and the power plants do not produce it. There are millions of households and businesses across China right now that would be willing to pay a higher price for access to reliable electricity, but due to regulations, this is not possible. This problem may have been exacerbated by ongoing trade tensions with Australia, which has historically been China's largest coal supplier, as well as a push by some local authorities to effectively reduce coal combustion before the 2022 Winter Olympics in an attempt to avoid smog that could embarrass the country on the world stage. This is a very interesting problem with so many moving parts that it is really difficult to see what will happen in the end. But in reality, I'm not raising this to talk about fundamental issues or to speculate on future problems in China. In fact, I'm too scared to do that. You absolutely should not invest in Chinese stocks. Even for the most experienced investors, the market for Chinese companies is not exactly the promised land of double-digit annual returns you might think it is. Just moments after the Chinese government repressed so many components of the tech industry in China, we've seen DD go down materially. I don't know how much DD has a stake in instruction, but let's take a look at what is perhaps the nation's most urgent problem at the moment. The real estate crisis. The real estate market in China is a multi-trillion-dollar time bomb. The company is the world's most indebted real estate developer, with about $300 billion in net debt. Its bonds are included in a series of indices across Asia, indirectly creating more than 3 million jobs apart from jokes. Even if there is nothing necessarily unique about the Chinese real estate situation, we saw similar problems last year in Texas with their variable pricing models that left millions of people without electricity and millions more with devastating energy bills. In reality, this is perhaps a symptom of a much larger economic factor, and that is the relationship between energy and prosperity. When we look at indicators and predictors of economic well-being, there are some things economists will turn to in order to paint a picture. GDP per capita, life expectancy, education level, corruption, and even combinations of these factors used to create things like the Human Development Index. But perhaps one of the strongest determinants of prosperity is access to energy. If we look at a list of countries that consume the most energy per capita, it almost perfectly aligns with the list of countries ranked by GDP per capita. The same is true if we look at just the aggregate numbers. Total energy consumption and total GDP tell a very similar story. But this raises two important questions. Is this a case of richer countries naturally using more energy to fuel more luxurious lifestyles? Or is it that countries with more power naturally become richer? Whatever the answer to this question, how do you explain this? China uses 7.5 million gigawatt-hours of electricity per year, which is almost a third of the total electricity consumption in the world and more than the next 7 largest economies combined. Despite this, their economy is still smaller than America's and certainly much smaller than all these other economies combined. So, what is going on? And why is there this massive apparent inefficiency? Let's take America as a generic advanced economy. Its electricity consumption is fairly evenly divided between residential, commercial, and industrial. There is also a small percentage that is used for transportation, like electric cars, buses, and trains. But for now, we can practically ignore that. Residential consumption is the largest share of this consumption and fundamentally represents everything that happens inside the home. It also represents activities done from home, for example, using a computer to work from home or maybe even mining Bitcoin in your basement. These should be considered commercial use, but the EPA, which created this report, doesn't have an effective way to monitor it, so they simply grouped it into residential. Despite these marginal factors, we can generally suppose that this is the sector that uses energy as a result of wealth rather than the sector that is increasing wealth. If we want to examine the use of energy that creates wealth, we should instead examine the commercial and industrial sectors. And by the way, if you are confused about the difference between the industrial sector and the commercial sector, don't worry, I was too. Fundamentally, the commercial sector is composed of offices, storefronts, warehouses, everything that serves to run a business that isn't physically the construction of a product. When you think of the industrial sector, think only of hard goods, factories, refineries, foundries, and yes, ironically, even power plants. Since 2020, the industrial sector represents less than a quarter of all electricity consumption in the United States, and it was a similar story even before the pandemic. When we compare this with China, we can see that 81% of their energy consumption is directed towards industry, and only 8% and 12% are directed towards commercial and residential applications, respectively. Now, this might not surprise many of you who are watching. Most of you are well aware that China has a much larger industrial sector than the United States, except that in reality, it doesn't. China's industrial sector had a nominal output of $4.7 trillion USD in 2017, while the United States had an industrial output of $3.6 trillion in the same year. If we analyze the numbers here, we can discover that China is using about 6 million gigawatt-hours for industry, while the United States is using 1 million. The implication is that the United States is almost 5 times more efficient in transforming electricity into value. So, what is going on here? Well, the first thing, obviously, is that China's data might not be super reliable. Almost every other country on this list has their energy production data recorded by the EIA, which stands for Energy Information Administration, a U.S. organization tasked with collecting information on energy production and usage around the world. China, on the other hand, chooses to publish its own data through the State Council, which is positive but lends a political tinge to what should be neutral objective data. China's electricity consumption, a key barometer of economic activity, maintained steady expansion in 2020 as the country concluded a year with solid economic recovery despite the devastating COVID-19 epidemic. It seems there is no way to know if this is accurate or not, but the government knows that energy usage is a statistic closely monitored by decision makers around the world, so it is not unrealistic to think they might have manipulated the numbers a bit. Something called purchasing power parity is the main reason for this apparent imbalance. $1 in China buys you much more than $1 in the United States, especially when it comes to manufactured goods and electricity. If we adjust for this purchasing power, then China's industrial production goes from being about 30% higher than America's to almost 200% higher than America's. In effect, they are really producing much more stuff than America. It's just that the stuff is worth much less in the Chinese market. This adjusted figure means that China still uses more electricity per dollar in manufacturing production compared to the United States, but not by much. If we assume that the actual figures for electricity production are somehow overstated, they might actually be on par. All of this means that energy is truly unique in the sense that it is both the chicken and the egg of economic wealth. It is both useful for creating wealth and determinant in determining wealth. For this reason, it can almost be considered the unrecognized global currency. Currencies are a way to store and use value efficiently. If you work a regular job, you are exchanging the value of your time and skills for money. That money is effectively a way to store that value until you use it to purchase a good or service that, in theory, should have the same value as what you contributed to your employer. I know this very broad definition might anger some people, but this is the theory. Now, money can take many forms: gold coins, figures on a computer, rectangles of paper, shells. In reality, it doesn't matter as long as people agree that it has value. Now, that value can be very abstract. I'm sure there are some of you watching who will say that fiat currency, which is by far the most commonly used currency in the world today, doesn't really have value. Those same viewers might advocate for a return to the gold standard because gold is a bit more tangible as a store of value, especially because it can't simply be created out of thin air. But even gold derives most of its value from people believing that it has value. Sure, it's rare, and it's a great conductor, and it looks pretty, but it's just a metal. Being stranded on a desert island with a gold bar is just as bad as being stranded on an island with a wad of cash. And in reality, a brief note on the margin is that the scarcity of gold is actually a significant problem when trying to use it as currency. Most economies around the world today aim for a low level of inflation of about 1 or 3%, depending on the central bank doing it, so people are motivated to invest or spend their money, which stimulates the economy. If a finite resource like gold were used as currency, then many people would simply choose to hold on to it, knowing that the economy will grow but the money supply won't, making their holdings more precious every year. This stagnation would choke economic growth, which is why most economists view moderate inflation as preferable to deflation. However, all of this is to say that gold is not much better than rectangles of paper when it comes to being a real store of value or a currency, both of which almost entirely depend on people agreeing that they have value. This is where energy is different. It has real value both in the sense that it can be used to add value to other things and in the sense that it can be used to improve one's quality of life, not just for humans but for all life as we know it. It has given value to energy more than anything else. Trees harness the sun for photosynthesis, lions hunt zebras for their calories, and humans fight entire wars for access to oil reserves. An economy that prints a lot of money is not necessarily rich, and even all the gold in the world doesn't mean much unless it can be exchanged for something else. Just ask Midas. But an economy that can produce a lot of energy is simply rich. Not enough water? Oh well, just use desalination plants. No natural resources? Import them and then use your unlimited supply of energy to transfer almost all raw materials into a value-added product. Export that product with a markup and then import even more raw materials. This is, in practice, what Iceland does today, albeit to a less extreme degree. So, if you want to see how it works in reality, go watch that video after this one. Economics is a study of scarcity, and theoretically, any economic problem can be solved with unlimited energy. Furthermore, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed into more useful forms almost infinitely. Someone sitting on a lifetime's worth of kilowatt hours will probably see the value of those savings diminish over time as an economy increases its capacity to generate energy in useful forms. Obviously, if this energy-based currency were to become a reality, we wouldn't be walking around with pockets full of batteries. We would probably do what we used to do with gold a long time ago and exchange banknotes that indicate a set value of energy that would be stored somewhere better equipped to hold it, like a reserve battery. In any case, is this likely to be adopted? Obviously not, at least not in the immediate future. But understanding this relationship between wealth and energy can actually be a very perspicacious way to view global economic events. In the comments, share your direct experience related to the topic covered today. We want to learn more and will gladly respond to any questions. Comment to let us know how we can improve. Your like would make us happy. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video.